In late 2024, a chip roughly the size of a postage stamp completed a specific computational benchmark in under 5 minutes. The research team behind it published their estimate of how long the same task would take on the fastest classical supercomputer, longer than the current age of the universe. That result is peer-reviewed and in print. On the other side of the race, China's Zuchongzhi line has posted its own sampling benchmarks. Processors operating at meaningful scale, with performance claims the research group describes in preprints that are still awaiting independent review. 2 processor families, 2 architectural philosophies, 2 bets on which road actually reaches a fault-tolerant machine first, and the distance between them is not what either camp's press materials suggest. The Western bet, anchored in Google's Willow path, is that fewer, higher fidelity qubits with demonstrated below-threshold error correction is the faster route to a useful machine. The Chinese bet, carried by the Zuchongzhi program, is that scaling raw processor size and accumulating sampling-based advantage claims builds the platform from which error correction will eventually follow. What follows prices those 2 bets against the best available evidence, the metric on which the favored bet plainly trails, the single result that moved the line most, and what would have to happen next for either side to pull decisively ahead. The hinge on which every weighing turns is a specific technical condition called below-threshold error correction. This is the point where adding more physical qubits to protect a single logical qubit actually reduces the error rate, rather than compounding it. For most of quantum computing's history, processors have operated on the wrong side of that line, meaning that error correction made the overall error rate worse, not better, because the machinery of correction introduced more noise than it removed. Whichever bet reaches stable, scalable below-threshold operation first is the bet that wins the longer race. Every claim in this pricing returns to that condition, because without it, neither sampling benchmarks nor raw qubit counts translate into a machine that solves problems anyone needs solved. To understand why that threshold matters so much, consider what a logical qubit actually requires. A physical qubit is an unstable system, prone to flipping its state in response to the slightest environmental disturbance, a vibration, a stray electromagnetic field, a thermal fluctuation. A logical qubit is constructed by assembling a large collection of those physical qubits, cross-checking their states continuously, and using the majority signal to reconstruct what the correct answer should be, filtering out the errors before they corrupt the computation. The catch is brutal. A noisier physical qubit requires a much larger collection to protect a single logical one. If the error rate is high enough, a processor might need hundreds of physical qubits to encode a single protected logical qubit. At that ratio, a chip with more physical qubits but lower individual fidelity can end up with fewer usable logical qubits than a smaller, cleaner chip, which is why fidelity is not an aesthetic preference, but a deeply economic one. Zuchongzhi's sampling claims are the scale-first bet's strongest current evidence. The research group's preprints describe random circuit sampling results that, by their own account, represent a regime where classical simulation becomes genuinely difficult. If that claim holds, it means these processors are operating at a scale where quantum effects are real, and the classical world cannot easily replicate what they are doing. That is meaningful. But random circuit sampling advantage is not fault-tolerant computation, and the distinction is not a technicality. The sampling task is specifically chosen because it is hard to simulate classically, not because it solves a problem with economic or scientific value. A sampling win does not transfer automatically to the structured algorithms, quantum chemistry, optimization, the kinds of tasks where a fault-tolerant machine would generate real returns. The group's preprints have not been peer-reviewed as of the time this pricing was prepared, and no independent laboratory has reproduced the classical hardness claim under adversarial conditions. The result may be real. The verification infrastructure around it is not yet in place. That uncertainty keeps a wide interval around any odds move this evidence would otherwise justify, and the line shifts only modestly toward the scale-first bet on this weighing alone. The result that moves the line most is Willow's below-threshold demonstration. This is the specific experimental finding where adding more physical qubits to a logical qubit improved the error rate rather than compounding it. The condition the fidelity first bet required to prove its thesis was physically achievable and not merely theoretically elegant. The result is published in a peer-reviewed journal. The experimental conditions are documented. The methodology is available for scrutiny. In a field where press release physics is common, where vendor claims routinely outrun verified results by years, that distinction matters enormously. This is not a preprint, not a vendor benchmark run under conditions selected to flatter the machine. It is a reviewed result, and the primary structural objection available to the scale first bet, that below threshold operation, might not be achievable with current physical qubit quality, is now experimentally weaker than it was before that paper appeared. The line shifts meaningfully toward the fidelity first bet on this weighing, more than on any other single piece of evidence currently in public view. Now the honest concession, priced flat. On raw physical qubit count and processor size, the Zuchongzhi line currently leads. China's processors have, by the group's own published figures, reached physical qubit counts that the Willow chip does not match. The standard rebuttal is that physical qubit count is the wrong metric, that the relevant figure is logical qubit count, and that a machine with more physical qubits but higher error rates can require so much overhead per logical qubit that the count advantage evaporates. That rebuttal is correct, it does not erase the lead. The fidelity first bet is behind on the metric it chose to deprioritize, and if error correction overhead turns out to be more manageable than current theoretical estimates suggest, a genuine uncertainty, not a dismissed one. That physical count lead matters more than the fidelity first camp currently prices it. The scale first bet gains ground on this weighing. That move is priced here without qualification. The fourth weighing concerns the constraint that shaped the Zuchongzhi program's architecture in the first place. Cut off from access to the most advanced Western fabrication processes and certain design tool chains, China's quantum hardware groups could not simply replicate the Willow path, even if they had chosen to. That constraint pushed the Zuchongzhi program toward a different scaling strategy: aggressive physical qubit density, sampling demonstrations, and the engineering base that comes from building and operating large processors at sustained scale. The argument that constraint became catalyst is structurally plausible and consistent with documented patterns in technology development under export pressure. What is observable, without requiring access to proprietary fabrication data, is that the Zuchongzhi program has continued to publish results at meaningful scale. A program that had been stopped by its constraints would not be publishing at all. Independent fabrication capability is not equivalent fabrication capability. If gate fidelity is the binding constraint on reaching fault tolerance, a process that trails the leading edge by meaningful margin remains a real handicap, regardless of the engineering creativity applied to working around it. But the constraint became catalyst effect is real enough to keep the scale first bet viable, and explains why the line is closer than a straightforward reading of the fidelity gap would suggest. It does not make the scale first bet the favorite. Below threshold error correction is also the point where the analogy to something physically graspable earns its place. Below the threshold, adding more physical qubits to protect a logical one improves the outcome. The correction machinery is working faster than the errors accumulate. Above it, more qubits just amplify the noise, and the correction machinery becomes the problem rather than the solution. For most of this field's history, processors have been above that threshold. The Willow result is a documented instance of crossing to the other side, however narrowly under controlled laboratory conditions. That crossing is the precondition the fidelity first bet needed to demonstrate. It is not proof of arrival at a useful machine. The distance between proving the mechanism works and building a processor with enough logical qubits to run a commercially relevant algorithm is still very large, and the timeline for covering that distance is genuinely uncertain. At the decisive weighing, three conditions keep the race open, even as the line moves. First, the Willow result is a laboratory demonstration of a precondition, not a demonstration of a fault-tolerant machine at useful scale. The physical qubit to logical qubit overhead required to run specific, commercially relevant algorithms on a fault-tolerant architecture is still an active research question. And if that overhead is higher than current estimates, the physical count lead of the Zuchongzhi line matters more than the fidelity first camp currently prices. Second, the Zuchongzhi sampling results, even unreviewed, suggest a program operating at genuine scale with genuine engineering competence. And if independent review confirms the classical hardness of those results, while the program simultaneously closes the fidelity gap through ongoing fabrication development, the current line compresses significantly. Neither condition has been met. Neither has been ruled out. Third, the below threshold result from Willow was demonstrated at a specific scale, and whether that condition holds and improves as the processor scales to higher physical qubit numbers has not yet been shown. Taken together, the fidelity first bet is favored on the current evidence, the peer-reviewed below threshold result is a real and meaningful advantage, and the margin is not wide enough to treat the scale first bet as closed. The overhead question is unresolved, and the physical count lead is real. 4 catalysts would move the line in the near term, and each one prices differently. The first is independent reproduction of the Zuchongzhi sampling results by a laboratory with no institutional stake in either program. If a neutral team reproduces the classical hardness claim under adversarial conditions, the preprint uncertainty collapses and the scale-first bet gains meaningful ground on the question of whether these large-scale processors are operating in a genuinely quantum regime. If reproduction fails, or if the hardness claim is found to be overstated, the line moves sharply toward the fidelity first bet, and the preprint gap becomes a credibility problem for the entire scale-first strategy. The second catalyst is whether the Willow below threshold result holds and improves as subsequent processor generations scale to higher physical qubit numbers. If the error suppression ratio continues to improve with scale, the fidelity first bet's overhead argument strengthens considerably, and the distance to useful logical qubit count shortens on a predictable curve. If the suppression ratio plateaus or degrades at higher scale, which would suggest the below threshold condition is sensitive to processor size in ways not yet understood, the line compresses back toward the scale first bet, because the fidelity advantage would be shown to be fragile at the sizes that matter. The third catalyst is the one that would most directly challenge the current pricing, a peer-reviewed result from the Zuchongzhi program, specifically on error correction performance, not sampling advantage, but whether the program has achieved or is approaching below threshold conditions on its own architecture. If that result appears and survives review, the fidelity first bet's most distinctive current advantage disappears. It would no longer be the only program with a verified below threshold demonstration, and the physical count lead of the scale first bet becomes the dominant factor in the pricing. The odds would shift substantially. If no such result appears over the next several publication cycles, the gap in verified error correction capability widens, and the fidelity first bet's margin increases even without further Willow milestones. The fourth catalyst applies to both programs. Announcement of next-generation processor specifications benchmarked by an independent academic or national laboratory team, rather than by the programs themselves. Vendor benchmarks are not independent replications. Both programs have an incentive to select favorable tasks in favorable conditions. If either program's next processor is benchmarked externally, the resulting data carries far more pricing weight than any internally published result. A Zuchongzhi successor benchmarked independently and showing fidelity improvements would compress the line. A Willow successor benchmarked independently and showing logical qubit count growth at maintained fidelity would widen it. The independence of the benchmark is as important as the result itself. On the current evidence, the fidelity first bet is favored. The peer-reviewed below threshold result from Willow is the strongest publicly verified milestone in this race, and the constraint became catalyst dynamic that kept the Zuchongzhi program running has produced a formidable platform, but not yet a reviewed error correction result. The margin of that advantage is real, but not commanding. A meaningful edge rather than a decisive lead. Because the overhead question remains open, the physical count gap is genuine, and a single catalyst publication from either program could move the line within one cycle. The restriction that was supposed to keep China's quantum program from competing, limited access to leading Western fabrication and design tool chains, is the reason the Zuchongzhi architecture exists in its current form, with its current scale, and with the independent engineering base that gives it a path to closing the fidelity gap. The constraint created the bet. Below threshold error correction is still the hinge on which that bet turns. Willow has proven the condition is achievable under controlled laboratory conditions. Zuchongzhi has not yet published a reviewed result showing it has crossed the same line. Until that asymmetry resolves, the fidelity first path holds the edge, priced as a meaningful lead with a genuinely wide uncertainty interval, and both of those clauses belong in the same sentence. Which bet would you back with the next decade of quantum hardware investment? The program that holds the peer-reviewed error correction milestone, or the one that holds the larger processor and the independent fabrication base? Put your reasoning in the comments. If you want the next odds update when either program publishes a catalyst result, subscribe. This channel prices the line as the evidence moves, not after the outcome is already obvious.